and welcome to another episode of Digitalk Architects. We are here today with Michael Conniff. He is been in journalism and storytelling. Michael, please go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Well, I don't know where to start, but what I'm doing right now is a couple of things. First of all, I'm a writer first and foremost, so I'm always writing different things. At the moment, it's a novel about conspiracy theory, and I'm also diving headfirst into creative content with AI, taking a whole lifetime, almost 50 years of my stories, 10 novels, 50 short stories, many scripts, my journalism, and trying to deploy that into AI. And I'm really just kind of getting that off the ground, and I can talk about that in detail if you'd like. The other hat I wear is as a merchant banker, working with family offices as a consultant, trying to get great companies money, trying to get them public earlier than they might expect. And that's taken up a lot of my time. In addition, I have, like you, Carolina, I have two podcasts, The Accelerator and The Angel. And I've got two Substack newsletters. One, you can see the address on the screen here, conniff.substack.com. That's known as Michael Conniff's Community. The other is more tech-oriented, is oriented toward the Accelerator and the Angel, which are essentially about startups, both the founders and the people who give them money. And let's see, so I think it's a little hard to describe, sort of my background, but I really have two threads. One is the writer, editorial, journalist type of thread, but at the same time, and I describe that as sort of, I'm an old media person. By definition, I'm a third generation newspaper man, the son of a Pulitzer Prize winner. I take that super seriously. But at the same time, I was the first person hired full time at NBC, in new media, and I bet you can't guess the year. Before you were born, 1981. And
Actually,
so I've had
the year I was born.
The year you were born. Okay, so
There you go.
So now I know how old you are. But I've had these two parallel tracks that are, writing and technology, and then, old media and new media, tech and online, which are now, what's amazing now to me is that because of AI, even with all of its concerns, those two tracks are merging. So I feel like in a lot of ways, the very disparate threads of my career and my life are now coming together, which is very exciting.
So, we talked already, we've met, and I know, just like you were mentioning, you've spent a lifetime of mastering storytelling with your career in journalism and writing, and now a digital media, right? Like with your newsletters and such. Why do you think so many? And I know you work with startups, so let's put that out there. So why do you think so many startups are still struggling to communicate their value? Because I know that's a big part of what you do, right?
Yeah. And I would just amend, I'm not now getting into digital. The first big digital service I worked on was called Citicorp Global Report. It was the first online service aimed at non-technical users. And it was also one of the first profitable online services. And that was in 1982. So since then, I've been working on stuff. As to startups, well, starting up anything is hard. Having a bake sale at your local school is hard. It's all hard. And what happens is it's also overwhelming. So typically people get into it sometimes without even asking themselves why they're doing it, which is always the question I ask. Why are you doing it? And I normally will say, and I have a startup for storytelling workshops I used to do, where I'd say, describe your business in one sentence. And typically what they would do is they would describe what they do. We do this, we make a dress, or we customize this or that. And I say, that's what you do, but that's not who you are. And so I think storytelling for me really starts with, an authentic look, an unflinching look at who you are. Why you're doing it is very important, and why you should be doing it, and what's unique about you. So these are all questions, Carolina, I think that are very hard to ask yourself because it requires real self-examination. And in fact, I've had trouble, answering those questions myself. So, and when I was in startups, it was even more difficult, I think, because it's always evolving and you're always pivoting, and the reason you're doing things and what you're doing is always changing. The other thing is, and I think this is important, most people tell you, oh, I'm not a writer, but I think it's clear to me that we are all natural born storytellers. And I'll give you an example. When somebody who considers themselves not a writer, or writers for that matter, start to tell a story, they'll immediately switch into the present tense. So I'll give you an example. So someone will be sort of explaining, and then so I walk into the store. I go up to the counter. I tell the guy now what that person has done by switching to present tense. They've put you right in the story, and they've also started to tell a story. Like their
Mm-hmm.
mind, something inherent has clicked on. And as long as we've been around fireplaces as primitive humanity or scrolling onto cave walls, people have had a need to tell their story. And I think it's for a very obvious and interesting reason. It's that we have to know how to explain ourselves to ourselves. That's a big part of what makes us human. And if you think about it, when people at the end of life, unfortunately close to where I am now, people at the end of life get Alzheimer's or dementia or kind of lose their cognition and lose their
Right.
memories, what they're really losing is their story. They no longer have a story to tell. There's no longer a narrative. And we associate that loss quite rightly, or we think of that loss as a catastrophe, which it is, right? Because you no
Mm-hmm.
longer can explain yourself to yourself. And therefore, you no longer can explain why you're here and what you're doing. So I think the takeaway for me is that everyone can tell a story. They have to give themselves permission to tell the story. And then they have to be willing to change it and morph it according to, what the purpose is.
Got it. On that topic, and still talking about founders and startups, what advice would you give a SaaS founder or a small business who feels they have a good product but aren't being heard in their market, right? Maybe their message is off, whatever the case might be.
How they can be heard?
Yep.
Yeah, well, I think the getting your story straight is the first part. And then the second part is just as important, which is repeating the story over and over and over, particularly internally, so that everybody in the company is on the same page. And then externally, so that it's like a drum beat. It's like a drum beat. It keeps going, it keeps going, it keeps repeating. And you have to repeat things for them to sink in. Now, you're going to want to do all the social media stuff and the website and today you're probably, if certainly if you're in the consumer area, you're going to want to look at influencers or have become sort of the core of marketing. You'll notice I didn't say newspaper advertising or magazine advertising or television advertising. That's unlikely to
Yeah.
help. But I think it's all about, as long as you make it about the customer. So there's your story, why you're doing it, and then what you're bringing to the customer and to the market. And so I don't think you can go wrong emphasizing the benefits to a customer, whether this goes for SaaS, it goes for everything else. If you keep the customer front and center, you have a much better chance. And so, like, for example, Reid Hoffman wrote a very interesting book called Blitzscaling. He's the founder of LinkedIn and many other companies and a big deal VC. And he said that the most important thing you can do when you're starting a company is the first 100 customers is to spend as much time with those customers as you can, understanding them and listening,
Right.
right? It's really
Mm-hmm.
about listening and hearing what they're saying and responding to it. He said that Hoffman did because after you grow past 100 customers, you're never going to get to know your customers as well again, right? You're never going to have a chance to know all your customers except for the first 100 customers. So it seems kind of obvious and simple, but it's really about being out there with your customers, telling them your story. Here's my story, here's why we're doing it, here's what we think we have. And then you want to emphasize things like the uniqueness of the product, the differences in the product, things it does the competition doesn't do, why it's a breakthrough if it is, and all of those things. But I think that it's about committing to the story and then repeating the story over and over again. And then at that point, once you've conveyed the story to the customers, listening to customers and actually understanding what they're telling you and what they're trying to tell you and what they're saying.
Right. I think of, I mean, as with, I'm in marketing, so I think of not just my clients but our own business, right? How hard it is to get out there and put your message out there, but sometimes that's not the hard part. Honestly, the hard part is finding the right people that want to read or listen to your story and what you're trying to do, right? Because, like, for instance, I know, and it's also weird how it happens, and I'll tell you why. Um, I have a bunch of different clients. Some, some come from odd, let's call them odd industries that are not as popular, right? So I have one that's in the oil and gas delivery and their niche, right? So for us to get their message out there is actually not that hard, but you would think that would be harder, right? But then I have other clients, like I have clients in tech and I have clients in health. Health, it's easy. Tech, hard. And you would think that with everything that's going on right now, with all the technology and everything we have to talk about, that it would be easier to find people, but it's so saturated that it's hard to find the audience for those clients. And then I think of ourselves and I'm like, we're putting out a ton of content, right? We write blogs, we do the podcast, and the podcast then give us material for some of our social media, but we're also writing content for LinkedIn, and it behaves so differently from one to the other, but it is hard to find that right audience, especially in that B2B market, right?
Well, I would say I make a distinction. My Substack newsletter is called Michael Conniff's Community. And so
Hmm.
I make a distinction between audience and community. Audience is one way. Audience is
Right.
what you have when you go to a movie. Audience is what you have for television shows, for basically
Right.
linear way communication, media, entertainment. I think that a community is quite different because when it's working right, you have people talking to each other as well. So now it's not just
Hmm.
you throwing content at them, but it's them interacting as well. And um, I think that's critically important, that distinction. But it's, some of these audiences or communities, as I like to call them, that you've mentioned, they're not really living on social media or on websites the way a younger audience might, right? So they're not
Right.
necessarily going to be listening to influencers. They're not necessarily going to be, posting on LinkedIn or Facebook or anything like that. So
Right.
it's harder to find the right vehicles. I mean, I think the newsletters are really great, but even a popular newsletter would be very happy getting a 50% open rate. So half the people are not looking at it. So you have that problem. But to me, I would also say that once you get to the community side of it, that you really become more of a vehicle for your community, right? You're really trying to, I don't think, content is, to me, has never been one way. The idea, my dad was a great journalist, and he used to say, you probably have never even seen this, Carolina, given that you were born the same year I got online. Um, he used to say, and he was an old newspaper man when he started. I think there were 14 newspapers in New York, if you can imagine that. Maybe
Mhm.
more like 20. He started in the 30s, 1936. But he used to say the
Wow.
greatest feature in a newspaper by far is the inquiring photographer. So have you ever heard of that?
No.
So the New York Daily News, for example, used to every single day send out a photographer and just ask ordinary people questions and take their picture
Okay.
and get their answer and put it in the paper. Now, the question is, why did my father think that was genius? And the answer is because it guaranteed those people were going to buy the newspaper.
Actually, yeah, you're right.
And if you do that every day, that's one of the ways you build. It was actually, in retrospect, it was actually one of the first social media uses of media because it was
Hmm.
social. And the other thing about it was that it was open to everybody. It wasn't important people. It wasn't unimportant people. It was just
It was
all
just
people.
average, regular people walking on the streets.
Walked in.
Okay.
We don't call it this anymore, but it used to be known as the man on the street interview.
Okay.
And by the way, just parenthetically, Jay Leno, the comedian, elevated this to an
Yeah.
art form on The Tonight Show when he would ask people about history and they would have no idea what they were talking about. So anyway, it's a great feature. It can be funny and all of those things. But I think that it also brought those people into the community of the newspaper in that case. So to me, it's all about connecting and using the content to connect people not just to you and what you're selling them, but to the community and their common interests.
Very good. All right. Let's go to the next question. So, from your experience, you've launched ventures where you were ahead of their time. And I know you told me a little bit about it, from interactive sports stuff to blogging platforms. Tell us what you've learned about timing and innovation and how that affects marketing or investor traction.
Well, I'm an expert in getting there too early. That's my modus operandi. And so this is in business. Let me make a little bit of an editorial statement. People say you have to be the first mover, and they make a big deal about being first. But was Google a first mover? Do you know?
No,
It
it
was
was not.
I think it was about the seventh search engine, something like that, seventh or 10th, something in there. It was not
Yeah.
nearly the first one. Arguably, it wasn't even the best one. And yet Google became the answer.
Yeah.
So I think
We don't
that,
search with Google, right?
yeah, actually, I've stopped searching with Google. I now do all my searching on Perplexity AI.
So do I, actually.
It gives a better result. And Google is in just a ton of trouble. And I don't even know they understand how much trouble they're in, because you don't need it anymore. And that decision they made a long time ago to provide advertising with Google AdSense, that's like
Hmm.
completely going to be upside down very quickly. And I think we're seeing the early signs of that. But going back to your question, I think that being early to the party is not something I recommend. So I did it. I've done it a lot, but the two times I really did it was with interactive sports, as you mentioned, and then a company called Post Time Media. Interactive sports with digital technology and analytics, and Post Time Media with blogging. So in both cases, it caused a lot of problems. Number one, what happens is nobody knows what you're talking about. I mean, think about what it would be to be selling a blog when nobody even knows what a blog is, right? So you have to do all
Right.
that early stuff, all that early digging. And it also means when you're early, there's not a history of people doing what you're doing. So you kind of have to make all the mistakes yourself. So with interactive sports, we were there for the transition from analog to digital. They used to use VCRs and VHS tapes to record all their games. And ironically, this is still referred to as the game film, because
Hmm.
originally it was on film and they still call it film, which is sort of funny. But what happened was, I'll give you one very specific example. There was a great guy at the Green Bay Packers football team named Al Tremmel. He was the dean of the video coordinators, and the video coordinators, people on the team in charge of all the shooting of the video and the cataloging of the video. And so we had spent a lot of time cultivating him because we saw him as the key to the league. And but remember, we're early, so I go to him. See, I just went into the present tense. Did you hear this? So I go to
Yeah.
him and I say, Al, are you ready to buy? And Al says, I'm ready to buy. And I say, what do you think you might spend? Because you always have to find out what the budget is. What do you think you might spend
Hmm.
on? And he said $30,000. So I said, $30,000. Is that annually, or is that like just a one-time shot? And he said, just one time. We replace all the cameras with digital cameras and we'll be done. Now, fast forward 35, 40 years later, these same teams are all spending, I'm just ballparking, but like a minimum of 10, 20, $30 million on sports analytics and video.
Yeah.
Technology keeps advancing. They keep buying new technology. They keep using it to change how they do their players. So to give you a perspective on being early, we started in the early 90s, okay?
Right.
And so the movie Moneyball, which was
Hmm.
essentially what we were doing, using data, statistics, analytics to figure out what was most important to a team or to its performance. I don't know if you know that book or movie, great book by Michael Lewis. So Moneyball was what we were doing, but Moneyball wasn't going to come out for over 5 years.
It was
So
a great movie.
so when Moneyball came out, could go into a team and say, "Hey, we're doing Moneyball," and they would get it. But we had all those years where nobody knew what the bleep we were talking about. And so when
Hmm.
you're early, so this is why, and I would say like what we did then, we could start kind of the same company now and still be successful 30, 35 years later, I believe, because I think the need is still there. I mean, it's been addressed to some degree, but certainly not 100%. So that opportunity is still there. The blogging it had a slightly different ending to it, because with the blogging, we became the voice of the Aspen, Colorado community. That's where I was based. So we had
Okay.
50,000 unique monthly visitors. We had 80 bloggers. producing over 100,000 pieces of original content for free. We never paid anybody. They did it for free. It was around about the time we were actually mimicking Huffington Post, which became
Okay.
very successful very quickly.
Very.
So they had Huffington Post, we had Aspen Post, and I also wrote for Huffington Post for that matter. But so and I didn't get paid for Huffington Post either. So Aspen Post was like very successful in terms of we were the buzz. People were talking about us. People were getting on the site and commenting. It was a real home run in many ways. So it was tough to monetize. And then about 2 or 3 years into it, maybe four, Facebook came along, and all of a sudden, like the conversation shifted from us, Aspen Post, to them, Facebook, and the need for Aspen Post and kind of our competitive edge went away. So there's a case where we were early and then we were just overwhelmed by a much bigger competitor that we could not compete with, really. And so, there might have been ways to circumvent that and so on, but obviously media companies are still wrestling with how to embrace Facebook and social media and not doing a great job at it. So I think my advice is, this is not sort of in every situation, but I would say you have to be really careful when you're really early. And it's
Okay.
very much possible, if not likely, you can be too early. And also the corollary to that, Carolina, would be that the opportunities are there for a lot longer than you think. Like one last example here. So AI, right?
Mhm.
AI, the opportunity is today. There's still going to be
Agree.
massive opportunities in AI in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, maybe more than ever, right? So you don't necessarily have to be first. It certainly helps if you're best.
Yeah, I agree. So curious, were you able to, at any point in time, were you able to monetize the blogging
Well, yes,
platform?
yes and no, not in a successful long-term sense. We had the company for 12 well no, the Aspen Post we had for about 7, 8 years. We
Okay.
were, I think, the second company to sell a blog as an advertisement. So
Okay.
people paid us to blog on the site. But I'll tell you what happened. When we started out, we could get $1,000 for a digital banner on the homepage. But as websites proliferated, they got cheaper. And so there was kind of
Of
a race
course.
to the bottom. So we were able to charge less and less. That was a problem. We tried a Groupon. I don't know if you remember Groupon. We tried a Groupon
I
thing.
remember.
We made some money with that, but we never really, we had the same problem monetizing that media companies still have. This is why media companies are happening today, are struggling today. I talked to a board member of a newspaper company this week, and you know what they've done? They've cut everything they can cut. They're still losing money,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't know what to do. I mean, they wouldn't tell you that, but theoretically, they're exactly in the situation I was around 2010, where it's like, you know, it's difficult to find ways to monetize. Media companies are inherently difficult. Sports Illustrated, one of the most successful sports magazines of all time, was in the red for 20 years at Time Inc.
That's crazy.
So it takes a really long time, and particularly in the modern world, the modern digital world. So no, I would say we never really successfully monetized it, despite trying everything: email newsletters, Groupon, display advertising, blog tutorials. Well, that's now called sponsored content, but we tried everything and never really caught fire. I wish
What
we
do you
had.
think was the, yeah, I'm curious, and my curiosity is, it's about to in my next question. So what do you think was different from like your approach, and why, Huffington Post was successful in their approach?
I'm not sure. I mean, when you say Huffington Post was successful, Ariana Huffington sold, I believe she sold it for $35 million to
Mm-hmm.
AOL, and now it's part of BuzzFeed. So
Okay. I
successful
didn't
in the
know.
sense that it's still alive. But I also know, because I went to high school with Greg Coleman, who was president of Huffington Post for part of that they really had a pretty good tech platform at Huffington Post. They were able to really, it was sort of at the beginning of how do you get the eyeballs? Everyone wanted eyeballs. And they were,
Hmm.
like BuzzFeed later on, they were very good at kind of figuring out what was viral and then piggybacking on what was viral to get more traffic and
More
more use.
views.
But that model doesn't work anymore either. That's why BuzzFeed has kind of struggled. Greg was also president, by the way. So it's not a simple matter. I haven't. The only there's a former Disney person now at who formed his own company actually, and it's aimed at Hispanic media. I can't remember the name offhand. Forgive me. But I heard a podcast with him and I said, like, this guy actually has kind of figured out something, because what they've decided is they're a community. That word,
Okay.
right? They're a community.
Mm.
Part of their community's mission is to enable their influencers and the users such that they can kind of break out and do their own thing on the platform. So on their platforms. So that's a great example because it's targeted. It's Hispanics, Mexican, non-Mexican in the US, in Mexico versus Hispanics in the US. And they've kind of figured that out, that they've got a niche there, but it's a gigantic niche. It's the fastest growing niche. And they're figuring out a way to service the influencers who
Mm-hmm.
are really becoming more and more important. So if I were starting a media company today, which I'm not, I would kind of start with influencers. I would start with influencers and go from there. I think there's a great,
So
that's, by
define influencers.
the way, that's not an
I
original.
think that
Yeah.
define, in your opinion, influencers. When you talk about influencers, what are we talking about?
People who um, influence, who have the power to influence people to take action or to
Okay.
think differently about something. An influencer can get you to embrace an idea you wouldn't have otherwise, or it can get you to buy a coat you wouldn't have bought otherwise. So I think but it has to be tied to action, right? There's an action involved. So influencers move the dial. They move the dial with products. They move the dial with thought leadership. You don't hear with influencers much, but they really do that. And, they can drive sales. They can drive visibility, obviously. And of course, we live in a celebrity culture. So if you're a true celebrity, your amount of influence is just, almost immeasurable sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I don't have any confusion about what an influencer is. I think it's pretty clear.
Okay. All right. I want to touch, because, early on during the intro, you talked a little bit about embracing AI, right? And there's two things I want to touch on. One, I want you to, I know, like you said, you've embraced AI, but not just for writing, not just, what we call now just the plain chat GPT, but you're embracing other technologies. And I remember you mentioning 11 Labs to clone your voice and create now your audio content, and also this concept that you mentioned before to me about writing or creating a super novel, which is now storytelling format blending media, AI, and I think there is more to it. But I just want you to tell us about how you're embracing AI. How is it affecting your work and your workflow, and how you do your writing and your novel creation and your storytelling process, and then all of these AI tools you're embracing, because I think it's so interesting. I love technology, so I think we have to embrace it right now, even if you, like, you coming from very traditional
Old.
journalism, and yeah, but to embrace the new and kind of move forward, whether I think a lot of people that are hesitating want to hear about it. So please share with us what that's been like for you.
Yeah, no, that's a big part of, I think of it as the end of my journey. Actually, I don't want to be morbid, but nobody's going to live forever. So what I would do is, there's a line in our podcast here between you and me. It's kind of down the middle. So what I would say is that on the one side of the line, there are the existential concerns and problems that go with AI. And to a lesser extent, there's the creative problems that go with having this amazing tool to help and enhance your creativity. So, what I would say is, I feel very lucky to have written basically everything I've written before AI came along. Because if AI had been there, I definitely would have used it. I wouldn't have written what I wrote, or it would have come out very differently. So I would say that I don't see I feel for people today who are, I don't know if they're going to be writers like we knew it. I mean, there always will be writers, there always will be books, don't get me wrong, but it's going to be different. And you have this problem on this side of the line with AI slop, as John Oliver said on his show on HBO, which is just this, it's already overtaking Pinterest. I saw there was somebody who, I think on that show who said, she just wants to look at gardens. Every time she goes to a garden on Pinterest, it's a freaking 3D Salvador Dali garden that has nothing to do with the real world. She can't find gardens anymore online. And so there's real problems with that. There's real problems with copyright, plagiarism. I mean, basically, the companies with large language models make the argument that they had a right to scrape and scour the internet based on fair use doctrine in the United States. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I am married to an IP lawyer, but I'm not a lawyer. But I can tell you that there is no way that what they did was fair use. Fair use, for people who are not familiar with it, fair use means you might quote a paragraph of a book, right? And then
Right.
paraphrase it,
Yeah.
then you quote another a little more, or use their facts with attribution, right?
Hmm.
And the large language models just took it. They just they just literally, like this, right? Just took it all in.
Yeah.
And now they argue it was a classic case of don't ask for permission. Ask
As
for
for
what's
forgiveness.
ask for forgiveness. Yeah, don't ask for. So now they're asking for forgiveness. Disney just filed suit because people are stealing Darth Vader and Mickey Mouse just verbatim. Right? There's no difference. They've completely stolen them. Anyway, okay, so that's on this side of the ledger. Okay, so I'm giving you all a little quick look at all the bad stuff. Right now, I'm going to talk about the good
Yeah.
stuff from a creator standpoint, and this is where I'm focused. I have so much original content. And now I can turn it into graphic novels. I can literally turn the text to movie prompts. You can write a movie using prompts.
Yeah.
In my case, I've done a couple things. I have cloned my voice with 11 Labs. This is going to enable me to mount audiobooks very quickly. By the way, the clone version of me is better than me because it doesn't make any mistakes, and it's absolutely uncanny how much like me it sounds. You could not
Sounds.
tell. So that's one thing. I also wrote a book called Write Good, which you can get on Amazon. It's 36 writing rules made to be broken. But I have a free app I urge you all to use called writegood.ai, which has kind of incorporated these rules into an AI app so that, when you upload something into Write Good AI, you're kind of drinking my Kool-Aid because the text will be reformatted according to my rules. So, and they came from, working with people for a long, long time as a writing coach and helping people with their writing. I'm doing other stuff too. And mainly you mentioned the super novel. So the super novel was an idea I had to use all forms and genres to tell a story. And I had this idea 30 years ago. I've been writing a journal about it ever since. The journal's now like over 100,000 words. I've given this a lot of thought. And in reality, there was no way to do what I wanted to do until OpenAI came along with ChatGPT. So, the flood, the dam broke, and now there are nothing but tools to do all the things I've
Hmm.
ever wanted to do. So now that's what I'm doing. I'm going to doing graphic novels. I'm working on text to movies. I'm going to do as many of these things as I can. That was my original super novel concept. And remember, when I had it, again, this goes back to being too early, right? This is a case of I was too early by decades, but now it's
Hmm.
paying off. So this is a case of being too early, and the world caught up to me.
Hmm.
Theoretically, the world caught up to me and has now gone way past me because what people can do now is way beyond anything I could imagine. So the challenge for me
Right.
is finding the platforms and taking advantage of them, creating the super. I have a big sort of magnum opus called the Book of Ocals. I'm really excited about these tools, and it's what I always wanted to do, and now you can do it. So I'm a lucky guy.
So, well, yeah, we are lucky, kinda. Like you said, there are some negative aspects to AI, which we can sit and talk about them for hours. Because it's not just the copywriting and all the stuff you mentioned, but also how bad actors are using it, right? But there is a lot of good things that come with it. But my question to you right now is, do you think AI is enhancing storytelling, or is it rather replacing human creativity?
Yeah, I think it's definitely replacing human creativity. There's no doubt about that. It is enhancing storytelling. I'm kind of, when I say I was lucky, what I meant was I'm in a position where I've already done my content. I have my content. So now
Yeah.
it's just a matter of how do I deploy it. But I'll give you an example. One of the best tools I've found is Google LM Notebook Plus.
Oh,
And
I
it's
love
allowed
that.
to up you like that. Yeah, you can
Yeah,
upload
I
up
love it.
sources and do your research within your own kind of walled garden, I call it,
Yeah.
inside the walls. And so I routinely do this when I'm working on, I mentioned I'm working on a novel on conspiracy theory. So, I was looking at 9/11 and, created a Google
Mhm.
notebook on everything about 9/11 relevant. And then I can query that, I can search it. And you can also say, write me a story based on this. I've tried to resist that, but as a research tool, it's been unbelievable. So that's a good thing. And in terms of creativity, I mean, look, most people are not creative artists, novelists like I am. So to be able to, instead of just facing a blank page, facing a large language model chatbot and being able to help you, generate ideas. On the face of it, that's great. In reality, people are going to stop writing things, already have stopped writing things themselves. I know someone who's written a book, a friend of mine, the old-fashioned way, but in his next two books, it's going to be driven. So I think my advice to writers would be make sure to keep writing original stuff because there's going to be less and less of it. Well, there are nothing but ethical and moral and creative challenges, but what I've done is put on the blinders in a way because what I'm doing is I'm completely focused on stuff that I own, original content. And guess what?
Mhm.
Here's the beauty of it. You get to do whatever you want with it. Nobody can tell you what to do. You own it. The minute you finish it, I don't know if you know this, the minute you finish a book, you have the copyright on that. You don't even have to file for it, right? So I'm not naive about this because I know there's going to be horrendous consequences. By the way, this happens with every technology. When social media came along, I taught for 5 years at a school I co-founded called the Isaacson School for New Media in Aspen. And I never once understood how toxic the algorithms were. It never came up. It was very benign. And look what happened, right? So
Mhm.
that's the story of technology. That happens over and over again. That's going to happen with AI and is already happening very quickly with AI. Putting aside the bigger existential threat of AI, of like taking humans out of the equation when it comes to life and death. But for me, the blinders are go like this. It's like, here's my world, right? I'm at my desk. Here's my world. Over here are the things I've created in the computer, in Google Cloud. Here's the things I've created. I get to do whatever I want with them. So the fact that somebody would use 11 Labs nefariously is not my problem because I'm not doing that. I'm very strict about that. I'm going to be very strict about, write me a movie in the style of Martin Scorsese. I'm not sure I'll ever do that in a prompt. I feel fairly strong, but I might change my mind. But I feel like when you're doing that, you're kind of cheating and stealing in a way.
Mhm.
But I may not feel that way forever. It may become so commonplace. But I think that the real thing I'd leave you with here is that the spark of creativity and human creativity. People say, well, nobody will ever replace that. Well, guess what? That is going to be replaced. But that doesn't mean it's not still important because there's always going to be a place for the individual with the great idea, with the great ability to write or to draw or to paint or to do anything artistic. But now you've got this 1,000-pound gorilla called AI in the room. And for me, given that I've written all that I've written, it just makes sense to do everything I can to embrace it. And the bad stuff is really completely out of my control. So I'm going to try not to worry about it until I have to. I think they never get their story straight. I think this goes back to where we started. They don't understand what they really have. They don't really understand the benefit of what they have, and therefore they have a very difficult time conveying it. In other words, not getting your story right, not getting your story straight is the original sin of marketing. Because if you don't get that straight, how are you going to convey it to customers or to anyone else, right? How are you going to build a community? So to me, you can go down the line with every company that gets it wrong, but you can also look at companies that get it right, like Coca-Cola is sort of an obvious example. There are a lot of big obvious examples of companies that really understand this and get it right. Nike for a long time, though maybe not recently. They're brands, because to me, storytelling precedes brand. And the story of Nike is Philip Knight running in at the University of Oregon for a guy named Bill Bowerman, who literally in his kitchen took a waffle iron and put the first waffle sole shoe on the waffle or rubber on the waffle iron, and it turned into a incredible thing called Nike. That's kind of, but it started where it started, and how it started is incredibly important. And I don't think we should ever forget that, or there'll be one missed opportunity after another.
What's your favorite media format right now for your storytelling?
Creatively, you mean, when I'm doing it?
Yeah.
It'll always be the novel. I'm a novelist, and I wake up in the morning, get my coffee, and go try to write a novel almost every morning of my adult life. So I think it's
Amazing.
still the greatest form, providing the greatest freedom and the greatest opportunity.
Okay, a book or a writer that shaped your voice.
Well, I have to say my father was a great writer, Frank Conniff, and he wrote in a very specific style as a New York newspaper columnist. But I did my senior thesis in history at Harvard on his career, called The Making of an Anti-Communist. He was an anti-communist, and he had passed away. So as his kid, I really wanted to understand why he went in that direction. But consequently, I pretty much read everything he wrote. And he used to write 6 newspaper columns a week. He wrote every day
That's
except
amazing.
Sunday. Enormous amount of stuff, interviews, celebrity, really a great story. And I hope that he's still my biggest influence, because I really think he was terrific. And there's something about the way I write that really comes directly from him.
Very good. One marketing trend you're tired of?
Pop-up ads that follow you. I actually kind of like ads that follow you around. I got to admit, it's like when I like something, it's like it'll keep reminding me, you said you like this. Do you really like it? But let's see, marketing trends that I really don't. Oh, well, the stuff you go through on LinkedIn, this isn't exactly marketing, but it literally drives me crazy. When people I have just connected with leave me a message, and this is marketing. They are trying to market to me, and
Yeah.
they say, hey, Michael, how's it going? I absolutely, I will disconnect with that person so fast you won't know. I will never talk to them again. Or how about this? Hey, how's your day going? See,
So
what
you'd
they're
rather
trying to
than be
do.
direct about what they're contacting you about?
Yeah, it's like none of your freaking business how my day is going.
Okay.
You don't even know me. Why should you care? Like, it doesn't matter.
It's
Whereas
true.
if they said,
It's a good point.
how about if they said, hey, I was just thinking about something when I, got my coffee this morning. I thought you might be interested in it. Then I'm in. I'll make a comment. Then it's personal, right? But yeah, so that's
Yeah.
the LinkedIn reach out is, and just like there's so many IT firms and so many human resources firms. It's like it's endless, and it's pretty annoying. Yeah.
All right, last one.
The other big trend is like everything's fake now. So
Well, this is true. Yeah.
that's an incredible problem.
Yeah. Last one. Most exciting AI tool you're experimenting with?
Well, it would have to be the family of that can create text to video, text to film, text to movies. So, and I'm using them all. Google VEO 3, Kling 2.0. I just found out about C-Dance, made by ByteDance, that owns TikTok.
Yeah.
So there's a long list of them, right? And so they're all kind of vying neck and neck to be the best. And I just saw a YouTube video that said C-Dance is the best at the moment, which surprised me. But they're all incredibly good. That's the thing to remember. They're amazing. And I think the next frontier for me is to figure out how to write a prompt. I think that's a whole new art form. It doesn't, on the face of it, seem that artful, but I think maybe it could be. So I'm excited about that.
Excellent. Well, Michael, thank you so much for coming out and talking to us today. It was a pleasure. Your take on storytelling and writing is unique. So thank you for sharing this last almost an hour with us.
Well, it's been my pleasure too, and I wish you the best of luck, and rock on.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you in the next episode. Take care.